What if the Bible you hold sacred had been methodically edited? What if the God you've always pictured reigning alone once sat among other divine beings? Today, we expose what may be the most astonishing religious cover-up ever recorded. We'll uncover the gods erased before Yahweh, the divine figures scrubbed from Scripture, and the uneasy truths that confront the foundations of mainstream Christian belief. Picture this: the family Bible in your hands, the one your grandfather cherished, the one whose verses you grew up repeating. But now, imagine being told that full chapters, celestial figures, entire mythologies were intentionally cut out. What if the single God you've worshipped was originally just one among many on a divine council? This isn't speculation from the fringes. It's grounded in archaeology. It's supported by analysis of ancient writings. It's what academics have understood for years, while religious powers worked to keep it out of sight. We're talking about deities like El, believed to be the patriarch of all gods, Baal, the tempest god who rivaled Yahweh in might, and Asherah, who some believe may have been Yahweh's consort. These weren't imaginary to ancient people. They were real as the earth beneath their feet. And now, in 2025, as the U.S. struggles with religious nationalism and as political agendas invoke divine authority, it's more urgent than ever to confront these hidden facts. Because when you grasp how monotheism was shaped, when you uncover the political intentions behind sacred edits, everything starts to look different. Whether you're yearning to reconnect with ancestral African spirituality, or you're simply hungry for the deeper mysteries your childhood church never touched, this path will challenge you. It may unsettle you. It may stir doubt. And that's exactly what truth should do. Real truth doesn't hide from scrutiny. It doesn't need to be guarded by censorship. Truth can stand, even if buried for millennia. So, are you ready to question your entire framework? Ready to accept that the monotheistic faith you follow may have been born from polytheistic origins? Can you face the reality that your Bible might be just one lens on a much broader sacred story? Then, come along. Let's open the vault of truths religion kept hidden. The ancient world wasn't ruled by a lone distant god. It thrived with a chorus of deities. Storm gods, sun gods, fertility queens. They weren't chaos. They were divine structure. The Canaanites, the people inhabiting the Promised Land long before Israel, followed a complex theology led by a supreme god named El, whose very name means God. El stood as the revered elder, a fatherly figure whose rule was marked by wisdom and kindness, not fury. Sound familiar? It should, because the Hebrew term Elohim, which appears over 2,500 times in the Old Testament, shares roots with this Canaanite deity. But El didn't reign alone. His celestial court featured Baal, the thunder god who summoned rain, sustaining crops in the parched desert landscape. In such a world, Baal wasn't just relevant, he was vital to life. Alongside them stood Asherah, El's partner, often symbolized as the Tree of Life, a mother goddess representing creation, abundance, and fertility. These weren't abstract ideas. They were intimate, accessible deities to whom people could cry out, bargain with, and find meaning in. Modern archaeology has dismantled the tidy version of Israelite history that suggests they immediately embraced strict monotheism upon entering Canaan. Ancient writings unearthed at Kuntilat Ajrud mention Yahweh and his Asherah, hinting that even within early Israelite religion, Yahweh had a divine partner. Another find, the Khirbet el-Qam inscription, includes a blessing invoking both Yahweh and his Asherah. These aren't misreadings or theoretical claims. They're real, literal inscriptions carved into rock, and they force us to reconsider everything. For countless generations, Yahweh wasn't portrayed as the solitary, all-encompassing figure we know from modern faiths. He was part of a broader celestial household, complete with a spouse and kin. The very idea that unnerves many Christians today, that divinity might include feminine dimensions, was once completely ordinary, and that truth carries enormous weight for how we view cultural identity and religious ancestry. The spiritual roots that shaped ancient Judaism weren't limited to one patch of land. They reached across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and deep into African belief systems. The sacred feminine, later edited out of Judeo-Christian thought, continues to echo in spiritual traditions worldwide. But here's where the mystery deepens. If these deities were revered for generations and worshipped beside Yahweh, why were they erased? The answer uncovers one of the greatest suppressions in theological history. Yahweh's transformation from a regional warrior god into the sole universal deity wasn't just a natural spiritual evolution. It was a calculated ideological shift that required the removal of all rivals. Evidence now points to Yahweh having origins as a desert god of the Midianites or the Shasu nomads. Egyptian records from the 14th century BCE even mention a god named Yiku, possibly referring to Yahweh, linked to those wandering tribes. In other words, Yahweh didn't begin as an Israelite god at all. He was absorbed, then elevated within the broader Canaanite religious landscape. Early Israelites didn't deny the other gods' existence. They arranged them in hierarchy. Yahweh was simply chosen as their patron deity, while still recognizing that other divine beings held power too. This belief system is called henotheism, worshiping one god while still recognizing that others exist. You can see this clearly in verses like Exodus 15:11, which asks, "Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh?" Not instead of the gods, but among them. The merging of Yahweh and El marked a major turning point. Over time, El's names and titles were handed over to Yahweh. Terms like El Shaddai, El Elyon, and El Olam all became names used for Yahweh. In Genesis 14:22, Abraham meets Melchizedek, a priest of El Elyon, the Most High God. Later scribes tried to reinterpret this to mean Yahweh, but the older version suggests it was a meeting between priests of different divine systems. This blending of gods helps make sense of several puzzling Bible verses. Take Genesis 1, for example. Why does it use Elohim, a plural word, to describe creation? And why does God say, "Let us make humanity in our image"? Christian tradition claims this points to the Trinity, but that explanation comes much later. Originally, it hinted at a divine council, multiple gods taking part in creation. But the biggest change came when Baal, the storm god, became Yahweh's main rival. This wasn't just a religious disagreement. It was a deep struggle for Israel's spiritual identity. Baal brought the rain, ruled over the storms, and gave fertility to the land. In a farming society, that made him incredibly influential. When crops thrived, Baal was praised. During droughts, he was feared or blamed. This made Baal a direct threat to Yahweh's authority, especially as Israelites became farmers and relied on nature for survival. In 1 Kings 18, the Bible tells of Elijah defeating Baal's prophets on Mount Carmel, a clear win for Yahweh. But archaeology tells a different story. Baal worship kept thriving in Israel long after Elijah. Even Israelite and Judean kings had names tied to Baal. That showdown on the mountain wasn't the end. It was just one episode in a long, drawn-out religious conflict. What's truly interesting is that Yahweh later absorbed many of Baal's traits: storm imagery, thunderous voice, control over nature. All of it became part of how Yahweh was described. Psalm 29, with Yahweh's voice shaking the wilderness and snapping trees, uses language that originally described Baal. The power of the storm god got transferred to Israel's God. This pattern sped up during the Babylonian exile. When Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BCE and its leaders were exiled, it shook their faith. How could Yahweh allow his temple to fall? How could his chosen people be overrun? The exiled theologians came up with a new answer. Yahweh wasn't just their God. He was the only God. Other deities were either demoted into angels and demons or labeled fake idols with no real power. As a result, editors reworked the scriptures with this new theology in mind. Earlier texts that spoke of other gods got rewritten or reinterpreted. The divine council became a court of angels. The gods became nothing more than carved statues. That rich, layered spiritual past got flattened into a clean, monotheistic message. But hints of the old tradition still remain. They live on in the plural words, in mentions of a divine assembly, and in how Yahweh took on the features of the gods he replaced. You just need to know where to look. The religious revolution of ancient Israel mirrors what's happening today. Whenever politics cloaks itself in divine approval, when nationalism fuses with religion, when layered spiritual traditions are flattened into easy political slogans, we're witnessing the same forces that once reshaped Israel's theology. The gods that got erased weren't random victims. They embodied unique visions of the sacred, alternative spiritual paths, and distinct cultural memories. Removing them made faith neater, more centralized, and easier to use for control. But it also created silence, spiritual voids, and unresolved questions that still trouble monotheism. Learning about this hidden history doesn't destroy belief. It deepens it. It makes faith fuller, more grounded, and more honest. It helps us realize that the spiritual heritage we've inherited is richer, more diverse, and more globally connected than we've been told. One of the most hidden parts of this story is how deeply African spirituality shaped early biblical religion. When we examine the links between ancient Egypt and Israel, or compare African goddesses to Asherah, or trace trade and migration routes, a much wider spiritual world comes into view. Moses, raised among Egyptian royalty, surely knew Egyptian rituals. The monotheism of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who briefly elevated Aten, the sun god, has clear similarities to Israel's God. The great hymn to Aten even reads like Psalm 104. These echoes aren't accidental. Even the name Yahweh may have Egyptian roots. Some scholars tie it to the Egyptian verb to be, matching Yahweh's phrase in Exodus 3:14, "I am who I am." Whether that's correct or not, Egypt's impact on Israel's religion is obvious. And it doesn't stop there. The goddess Asherah, scrubbed from the Bible, shares traits with African goddesses across the continent. Her tree symbols, motherly traits, and ties to fertility and blessing mirror deities found along the Nile and deep into the Congo. So when African Americans explore these connections, they're not making things up. They're reclaiming truths that have been buried under centuries of religious edits and racial erasure. The spiritual traditions behind the Bible weren't created in isolation. They came from a vast, shared web of human spiritual discovery, one that absolutely includes Africa. And looking eastward, Mesopotamia also left its mark. The oldest cities in human history, Ur, Babylon, Nineveh, all shaped the stories and beliefs that made their way into the Bible. The Sumerian and Babylonian gods that shaped early biblical stories weren't just old myths. They were complex religious systems that explored justice, divine rule, and humanity's place in the cosmos. The Anunnaki, revered in Mesopotamian lore as the divine figures who gifted civilization to mankind, bear striking resemblance to the biblical divine council. Tales of gods intermingling with human women and producing giant offspring echo throughout both traditions. Flood legends, creation tales, ancient laws, these themes clearly moved across cultures, growing and changing as they passed from one people to the next. Once you see this, it's clear the Bible didn't drop from the sky in isolation. It was part of a global spiritual dialogue, a conversation that stretched from Africa to Asia to the heart of the Middle East. Erasing these connections wasn't about religious clarity. It was about asserting cultural dominance, rewriting history to elevate one worldview while erasing the rest. Genesis 6 and its mention of the Nephilim still hold pieces of that older, richer divine reality. though today they're often downplayed or dismissed. The Book of Enoch, excluded from the Bible yet preserved in Ethiopian scripture, goes even deeper. It gives vivid descriptions of divine beings interacting with humanity in ways later theology tried to erase. Why was it removed? Because it didn't fit the new image of a distant, singular God. Because it dared to keep the memory of a more direct, complex spiritual connection. These weren't just old legends. They were sacred memories. Ancient records of how early humans understood the gods, life, and their purpose. And when those stories were cut out, whole parts of our shared spiritual ancestry were lost. Now, in 2025, we have a unique opportunity to reflect on that ancient religious transformation. As we watch religious identity become weaponized in modern politics, as faith gets streamlined and twisted to fit nationalist goals, we're reliving what happened to Israel's theology long ago. The rise of Project 2025, a movement pushing to reshape America under Christian nationalist rule, eerily mirrors how ancient rulers used religion to secure power. Just like monarchs of old claimed divine rights and rewrote sacred tradition to serve their empires, today's leaders reduce faith into slogans to justify control. But now, unlike in the past, we have tools they never had. Archaeology, religious comparison, historical insight, and long-hidden text help us lift the veil. They allow us to expose the edits, understand the reasons, and rediscover spiritual truths once buried. Even today's economic struggles, dominating headlines in 2025, carry echoes of ancient patterns. The IMF's recent alarms about tariffs and trade wars strangely mirror ancient ideas, when wealth and harvest were seen as signs of divine approval. Baal, the god of rain and fertility, wasn't just about crops. He was tied directly to survival and economic success. The ancient rivalry between Baal and Yahweh was as much about material prosperity as it was about theology. So, when modern nations claim divine favor for their financial moves, or use sacred language to back trade policies and nationalism, they're replaying age-old patterns. Different gods, same power games. Today's global crises, from Ukraine's struggle to the turmoil in the Middle East, echo those same territorial and ideological fights that shaped ancient religion. Bible stories of holy war, conquest, and divine right weren't isolated events. They were reflections of deep-rooted human instincts. Seeing this doesn't cheapen our faith. It sharpens our view, helping us separate lasting spiritual truth from short-lived political spin. It helps us reclaim what's sacred and leave behind the propaganda. For those hungry to know where they really come from, this hidden history cuts deep. It pushes us beyond surface-level theology toward a fuller, more layered understanding. It shows us that the hands of men touched even the holiest texts, and yet the divine still shines through. But the biggest questions lie at the heart of what many refuse to touch: the plural word Elohim, the divine council scenes, the hints that creation and rule were shared tasks, not solo acts. Maybe what we've called polytheism was really a higher recognition of divine complexity. Maybe those ancient texts hint at real contact, encounters with entities not of this world. Maybe editing those texts was about control, not clarity. Think about it. Elohim shows up over 2,500 times in the Old Testament, and it's plural every time. The royal we excuse doesn't hold up in other ancient languages. When Genesis says, "Let us make man in our image," it suggests collaboration among beings beyond us. Psalm 82 shows God standing among the gods, judging them. This wasn't metaphor. It was divine governance. The Book of Enoch, still sacred in Ethiopian Christianity, goes even deeper. It details how the Watchers, fallen divine beings, shared forbidden wisdom with humanity. Not myth, not fantasy, cultural memory of real contact. Why hide this? Because it challenges the foundation of human self-image. Because it dares to say we're not alone, and never have been. that the divine isn't distant, it's interactive. The veil between heaven and earth was thinner than we're taught. And then there's the stars. Ancient texts speak of divine beings tied to constellations, of wisdom written in the sky, of beings who came from above. Not superstition, knowledge. Sirius, in particular, held deep meaning. African cultures like the Dogon knew about Sirius B, an invisible star modern science didn't find until the 1900s. How? Oral tradition, yes, but more than that. Ancestral contact. The Bible speaks of the host of heaven, of divine messengers linked to the stars. This wasn't just stargazing, it was cosmic dialogue. The erasure of this wisdom wasn't spiritual, it was strategic. They weren't just hiding myths, they were hiding the truth, that we've always been in contact with something greater. It means understanding that the African and Egyptian influences on biblical tradition weren't side notes. They were foundational elements deliberately buried under layers of revision. It means reclaiming that suppressed wisdom, not to rewrite faith, but to restore it to its fuller, truer form. Because when you trace the hidden threads, Asherah's erased presence, the cosmic role of the Elohim, the Watchers and their forbidden knowledge, the echoes of Sirius in African sky lore, you realize the story is bigger, older, and more connected than you were ever told. The truth is not meant to be feared, it's meant to be known. And when the fragments are pieced together, when the silence is broken and the erased voices are heard again, what emerges is not confusion, but clarity. The divine was never simple. It was never meant to fit into a single name, a single book, a single creed. The real scandal of religion isn't that people once believed in many gods, it's that those gods held truths we still need. The feminine, the cosmic, the ancestral, all of it matters. And in 2025, as people search for meaning in a world clouded by politics, fear, and manipulation, this forgotten wisdom isn't just history. It's medicine, not to divide, but to heal, not to replace, but to remember. Because once you see what was hidden, you can never unsee it, and that's when the real awakening begins.